The night of prom was supposed to be magical, the grand finale to our high school years. I had always been a skeptic, someone who rolled her eyes at ghost stories and scoffed at urban legends. But that was before that night, before the silent dance. Our school, Crestwood High, had chosen a peculiar venue for the event, an abandoned opera house on the outskirts of town. It was a relic from the early 1900s, its once glorious halls now cloaked in dust and decay. Rumors surrounded the place, whispers of a fire that had claimed dozens of lives during its final performance. Some said you could still hear music echoing from its halls late at night. I didn't believe in any of it. The prom committee had transformed the decaying opera house into something surreal. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and crimson drapes hung dramatically from the balconies. The air was thick with the scent of roses, though I could still detect an undercurrent of soot and charred wood. My date, Ethan, was the perfect gentleman, and for a while the night was everything I'd hoped. We danced, laughed, and took pictures with our friends. But as the clock neared midnight, something shifted. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, the music had stopped, and the DJ was gone. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd, but then, without warning, a soft melody began to play. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, eerie and haunting, a waltz that seemed to seep into my bones. "Where's it coming from?" Ethan asked, looking around. The answer became clear as the curtains on the grand stage slowly parted, revealing an ancient gramophone. Its horn gleamed under the dim light, though it was cracked and worn with age. The record spun slowly, emitting that haunting tune. "Is this part of the prom?" someone whispered, but no one had an answer. Then they appeared. Figures emerged from the shadows at the edges of the room, silent, faceless dancers clad in tattered ball gowns and suits. Their movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, as they glided onto the dance floor. "Who are they?" I whispered to Ethan. "They're not real," he replied, his voice trembling. I wanted to dismiss his fear, but something about the dancers was undeniably wrong. Their feet didn't seem to touch the ground, and their forms shimmered faintly, as if they weren't entirely solid. The crowd began to back away, pressing against the walls. A cold wind swept through the room, though the doors and windows were tightly shut. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Welcome to the silent dance." I turned toward the stage and saw him, a tall figure dressed in a charred tuxedo, his face obscured by a cracked porcelain mask. He tipped his hat with a flourish, and the gramophone's melody grew louder, more insistent. "Dance," he commanded, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Or join the shadows." At first, no one moved. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, couples began to step onto the dance floor. Their expressions were blank, their movements stiff. Ethan grabbed my hand, his grip tight. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't let them pull you in." But it was too late. The music wrapped around us like a vice, and I felt my feet betray me, stepping forward against my will. Ethan tried to hold me back, but the pull was too strong. "No," he shouted, but the music drowned him out. I found myself face to face with one of the faceless dancers. Up close, I saw that their gowns and suits were scorched, and their hands were skeletal. The figure bowed, and I was compelled to do the same. We began to waltz, the haunting melody dictating our every move. My heart pounded as I realized I couldn't stop. My body no longer obeyed me. I was a puppet to the music. Around me, others were falling into the same trance, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Ethan, however, fought back. I saw him weaving through the crowd, dodging the ghostly figures, his eyes locked on mine. "Hold on, Lily," he yelled. The masked man on the stage turned his head toward Ethan, as if noticing him for the first time. With a flick of his wrist, the faceless dancers swarmed Ethan, their movements unnervingly fast. "Run!" I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Ethan dodged and ducked, grabbing a fallen candelabra and swinging it wildly. The flames flickered but didn't die, and the ghostly figures recoiled. "They're afraid of fire," I realized. Ethan reached me, his hand seizing mine. The moment our fingers touched, the spell broke, and I stumbled back, free from the ghost's grasp. "We need to destroy the gramophone," Ethan said, his voice urgent. We fought our way to the stage, the faceless dancers closing in around us. Ethan threw the candelabra at the gramophone, but the flames flickered and went out before it could hit. "You cannot escape," the masked man intoned, his voice colder than death. Desperate, I grabbed a heavy spotlight from the edge of the stage and hurled it at the gramophone. It shattered on impact, and the haunting melody stopped abruptly. The faceless dancers froze, their forms flickering like dying flames. Then, one by one, they crumbled to ash. The masked man let out a guttural roar, his form unraveling as he dissolved into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. When we looked around, we were alone. The ballroom was in ruins, the decorations gone, the chandeliers shattered. Dust filled the air, and the scent of roses had been replaced by smoke and decay. "What just happened?" Ethan whispered. I didn't have an answer. As we stumbled outside, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, I glanced back at the opera house. Its windows glowed faintly, and I thought I saw the shadow of a figure watching us. To this day, I don't know what we escaped from, but sometimes when I hear an old waltz on the radio, I feel a familiar pull, and I wonder if the silent dance is waiting for me to return. It all started when the yearbooks arrived a week before prom. Everyone was excited to flip through the glossy pages and relive the highlights of our senior year. I'd always loved the tradition, scrawling little notes in the margins, collecting signatures from friends, and seeing our memories frozen in time. But there was something off about this year's yearbook. It looked normal enough at first glance. The cover was a classic black and gold design, with Class of 2025 embossed in elegant letters. As I flipped through it, though, I began to notice strange things. There were photos I didn't remember taking, candid shots of me in the hallway, sitting in the cafeteria, or walking home after school. In each picture, I wasn't smiling. In fact, I looked disturbed, as though I had just seen something terrifying. I turned to Ethan, my boyfriend, who was sitting next to me in the cafeteria. "Did you notice anything weird about the yearbook?" I asked, showing him the pictures. He furrowed his brow. "That's strange. Who would have taken those?" "I don't know," I said. "But it gets weirder." I flipped to the class photos. There, in the bottom row, was a girl I didn't recognize. She had long, dark hair that hung limply around her face and pale, sunken eyes. She wasn't smiling like the rest of us, and her name, Elizabeth Grayson, was printed beneath her picture. "Do you know her?" I asked Ethan, pointing to the photo. He shook his head. "No, I've never seen her before." Neither had I. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I decided to look through my old yearbooks. Elizabeth wasn't in any of them. Not in freshman year, not in sophomore year, not even in junior year. It was as if she'd appeared out of nowhere. I brought it up to my friends the next day, but no one had an explanation. "She's probably new," Clara said with a shrug. "You know how big our class is. It's easy to miss people." But it didn't feel that simple. The day of prom arrived, and for a while, I managed to push my worries aside. The venue was breathtaking, a grand, glass-walled hall overlooking a shimmering lake. The theme was a night under the stars, and the decorations made the room look like a scene from a fairy tale. I arrived with Ethan, dressed in a deep red gown that matched his tie. For the first hour or so, everything felt perfect. The music was lively, the food was amazing, and everyone seemed to be having the time of their lives. Then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, like a power surge, but then they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. "Probably just a blown fuse," Ethan said, squeezing my hand reassuringly. But then, through the darkness, I saw her. Elizabeth. She stood at the far end of the room, illuminated by the faint glow of the emergency lights. Her dress was torn and stained, and her pale eyes seemed to pierce the shadows. "She's here," I whispered, my throat dry. "Who?" Ethan asked, looking around. "Elizabeth. The girl from the yearbook." Before he could respond, a voice echoed through the hall. "Do you remember me?" It was her voice, low, cold, and filled with a quiet rage. The crowd fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. "You forgot me," she said, stepping closer. "You all forgot me." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "What are you talking about?" someone called out nervously. Elizabeth's expression twisted into something dark and vengeful. "I was one of you. I walked these halls, laughed in these classrooms. But when I was gone, none of you noticed. None of you cared." The room grew colder, and the faint hum of static filled the air. "Gone?" I whispered. She turned her gaze to me, and I felt as though she could see straight through me. "You didn't even remember my name," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "Not one of you wrote me in your yearbooks. Not one of you came to my funeral." Funeral. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't understand," I stammered. "What happened to you?" Elizabeth's pale lips curled into a bitter smile. I died, Lily. Junior year. But you all moved on, as if I never existed. A wave of dread washed over me. I tried to remember, but my mind was blank. No recollection of a death, no memory of her at all. The shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, creeping along the walls and ceiling. The air was thick, suffocating. You'll remember me now, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, engulfing the room. People screamed as the darkness swallowed them, their voices fading into silence. Ethan grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the exit. We have to get out of here. But no matter how far we ran, we couldn't find the door. The hall seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows closing in around us. Why are you doing this? I cried out, turning to face Elizabeth. Her eyes burned with a cold fire. You forgot me. Now you'll never forget. The last thing I saw was her face, twisted in anger, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the school gym, surrounded by the wreckage of the prom. Tables were overturned, decorations were torn, and the air was heavy with the smell of smoke. Ethan was beside me, his face pale and drawn. She's gone, he said softly. But when I looked down at the yearbook in my hands, her photo was still there. Only now, beneath her name, were 3 words I hadn't noticed before. In loving memory. And in the margin, written in faint, spidery handwriting, was a message that sent a chill down my spine. You'll never forget me now. I'll never forget the night of my senior prom. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of my high school years, a night of dancing, laughter, and memories to cherish forever. Instead, it became a haunting memory I'd spend the rest of my life trying to forget. The prom committee had chosen an old mansion just outside of town for the event. Dubbed Blackwood Manor, it was a sprawling estate that had fallen into disrepair. Rumors swirled about its past. A wealthy family had once owned it, but they'd disappeared without a trace nearly a century ago. Some said the place was cursed. Others claimed it was haunted. But to a group of teenagers looking for thrills, it was the perfect setting for a night of enchantment. I arrived with my best friend, Clara. She wore a shimmering blue gown that caught the light like water, while I'd opted for a simple black dress. As we stepped through the grand, arched doorway, I felt a chill. The air inside was cooler than it should have been for a spring evening, and the smell of damp wood and decay lingered. The ballroom was decorated lavishly. Twinkling fairy lights hung from the high ceilings, and golden candelabras cast flickering shadows across the room. Yet, despite the beauty, something felt off. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, moving as though they had a life of their own. The night started innocently enough. Music played, couples danced, and laughter echoed through the hall. But as the evening wore on, strange things began to happen. It started with small incidents. Someone's corsage disappeared, only to reappear moments later in a completely different spot. The punch bowl tipped over, though no one was near it. Clara and I laughed it off, attributing it to the excitement of the night, but deep down, I felt unease gnawing at me. At midnight, the DJ announced a special event, a scavenger hunt. Teams of 2 were given a list of cryptic clues and sent to explore the manor. Clara and I eagerly joined in, thrilled by the idea of venturing into the mansion's darker corners. Our first clue led us to the library, a vast room filled with ancient, dust-covered books. As we searched, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the light from our flashlights. "Do you hear that?" Clara whispered. I strained my ears. There was a faint sound, like whispers carried on the wind. But the windows were closed, and no one else was nearby. "I'm sure it's just the wind," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. We found our next clue tucked inside an old book. It led us to the attic, a space rumored to be the heart of the mansion's darkness. The stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended, and the air grew colder with each step. The attic was a cavernous space filled with forgotten relics, dusty trunks, cracked mirrors, and a single rocking chair that swayed gently, though there was no breeze. "Let's just grab the clue and go," Clara said, her voice trembling. As we searched, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words, but something primal and guttural, like the growls of a hungry beast. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. "Stay close," I whispered, grabbing Clara's hand. We fumbled through the shadows, our breaths shallow and quick. Suddenly, Clara screamed. I turned to find her staring at the rocking chair, which now held a figure, a pale, emaciated woman in a tattered dress, her hollow eyes fixed on us. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Clara toward the stairs. We raced down, the sound of footsteps echoing behind us, though we dared not look back. When we reached the ballroom, it was empty. The music had stopped, and the lights had dimmed to a faint, eerie glow. "Where is everyone?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, the grand doors slammed shut, and the shadows seemed to come alive. They slithered and writhed, forming shapes, figures with glowing red eyes and clawed hands. The room grew colder, and a deep, guttural voice echoed, "You shouldn't have come." I grabbed Clara's hand and ran, but the shadows pursued us, their laughter cruel and mocking. We burst into the foyer, where the front door stood ajar. Freedom was within reach, but as we stepped outside, we found ourselves back in the ballroom. "No, this isn't possible," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. The shadows closed in, and the voice boomed again, "This is your home now." Desperation took hold. I grabbed a nearby candelabra and swung it at the shadows, but it passed through them harmlessly. Clara screamed as one of the figures lunged, its claws sinking into her shoulder. "Let her go!" I shouted, but the creature only laughed, dragging her into the darkness. "Clara!" I chased after her, but the shadows swallowed her whole. And then, everything went silent. I woke up hours later, alone in the middle of the ballroom. The decorations were gone, replaced by cobwebs and decay. The once grand room was now a hollow shell, abandoned and lifeless. I stumbled outside, the morning sun blinding after the endless night. The mansion was silent, its windows dark and empty. I ran to the police, babbling about Clara and the shadows, but when they returned with me, the mansion was gone. All that remained was an overgrown field and a crumbling foundation. Years have passed, but I still hear Clara's screams in my dreams. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel a cold breath on the back of my neck and hear faint whispers calling my name. And on certain nights, when the moon is full, I swear I see the silhouette of Blackwood Manor in the distance, its windows glowing red.